All right, so we're going to start this second section of chapter 6. This is the wrong way, history of South Asia. There's the first slide. Um, Always the second section is really loaded with information, so we're going to go through thousands of years here. But there's definitely a couple of major themes that we're going to talk about in this. So as always, I encourage you to pause the video when you need to fill in your blanks on your note sheet. If you are at home and don't have that note sheet, then I would encourage you to either print it, or it is on Google Classroom. You can make a copy of that and then try to fill those in. It's much easier, I think, if it's on paper. So if you can print it, that's better. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is the earliest civilizations in this region of the Indian subcontinent. So that is the Indus River Valley. So this is modern day India here. The Indus River is over here on the kind of like northwest side. And it dates back about 3500 BC, which is, like over 5,000 years ago. And one of the more interesting areas that we'll talk about, especially since it existed so long ago. There are ruins of that at two different locations. One is Harappa and one of them is Mohenjo-Daro. And most of these, I think both of them are located in modern day Pakistan, but they had a large influence, obviously, on the history of India. They don't know really a ton about the civilization because they haven't been able to decipher their language. So they don't know exactly from the writings that they have available. They don't know exactly what they say, but there are the archaeology gives evidence of the civilization. And yeah, basically that's kind of where it says here, excavation remains the part of the way that they're trying to learn about it. So one of the things is that the city was laid out in like a grid-like format, which is kind of like how our cities are designed today. Like you take a look at a neighborhood, you have your roads that are north and south, your roads that are in the east and west, and the houses are kind of built around those roads. Not always, but that really is kind of how that works. They had flat roofs on them, so they could walk from like house to house. It doesn't talk about it in this presentation, I don't believe, but they arranged their cities in a way that they would catch a breeze and like they would stay cool. So it's kind of like a natural form of air conditioning. They had like this great bath that existed, which was like some sort of like communal place that people could meet. Probably not so much for like cleaning, but maybe for like social purposes or for religious purposes, cleansing that way. And then it had like ways that the water could drain. Houses had also like ways that water could flow out of it. So more advanced systems that wouldn't come for thousands of years later in Europe. Sanitation wasn't really great around like the time of like the bubonic plague. Even in medieval times, they just didn't have the kind of sanitation that even existed back then. So they didn't have like electricity and stuff, but they did have modern forms of that. So you can see kind of like that grid-like format here that existed. So pretty advanced for the time period. This is some of the like what's left over, these like seals, and what those seals kind of stood for. They try to figure that out. So pretty advanced society. They don't know exactly what caused its decline. There hasn't been a lot of evidence that they were warlike, and so they may have just been really conquered because somebody came in that was. But there's also the chance that this area does get earthquakes. So maybe an earthquake happened. It doesn't necessarily mean it like leveled the cities, but it could have diverted the water, and that's essential for life. So if the Indus River was flowing differently, then they may have had to move. So not exactly sure what happened, but this gives rise to the Aryan class later on. And one of the most important things about them is that they set up their social classes in what's called castes, and they use the word varnas here. And so the higher you up, the more power you have. So Brahmins were the priests, and they had the most power. And then there was the warriors, and then there was like farmers and merchants. And then you have the Sudras, the laborers and the peasants. So you didn't want to be down here. And you were kind of locked into this. So like if you were a laborer, you could only marry somebody that was also a laborer. You couldn't think about moving up the class system. It's very different than the way we live here in the United States, where, maybe you're born into a poor family, but you become a millionaire one day. You invent something or you become a famous actor. I mean, it could be a variety of things, right? You're not limited by your social class. And so this would be a lasting thing, like for centuries in India, that the caste system, and it was outlawed in 1947 with India's independence, but I still think that it's prevalent. Like, families only want their children to associate with other social classes that are the same as them. So the wealthy stay with the wealthy, the poor stay with the poor, and then there's finally this untouchables, and these are like the outcasts of the society, and you wouldn't want to be an untouchable. So just they don't have access to the same kind of things that everybody at the higher levels would have. So that still, even in recent years, there's still evidence that this is long lasting and it still affects. So that's one of the biggest influences by the Aryan civilization that came after the Indus River Valley civilization. You can see it kind of broken down here a little bit more. And then they kind of list the well-known members. We're going to talk about Gandhi a little bit later on. Siddhartha Gautama, who will be the Buddha, he was in this class. So you kind of fall into this class just based on where you're born, and you really can't change that for your entire life. But also the Aryans brought in made major influences on literacy. So their language was Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is a parent language of modern day Hindi, which is one of the major languages today in India. And then it would go on also to influence Greek and Latin, because it's an older language than that. So Sanskrit is kind of an archaic language. I think it is. I don't think it's still spoken in the world, but it's one of those things that scholars would learn so that they can read things written long ago. So two influences by the Aryans were the class system and the influence on language through Sanskrit. And this is, we can see the Vedas, which are these religious texts, and they would kind of be important for Hinduism. Hinduism, we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. So Hinduism is interesting because it doesn't really have like one chief religious leader or just one religious text. And there's no like central temple. So there are multiple gods and goddesses in Hinduism. We'll look at some of those in class, and that's what makes it a polytheistic religion. Poly meaning many, and theistic meaning gods. Some of them are like Brahma, who is the creator. Shiva is the destroyer, so like a protector of things. There's Vishnu. Side note for you here, the Beatles were like heavily influenced by parts of Hinduism. So they have a song that mentions Krishna, which is another one of the gods. So if your parents like Beatles, or anybody else in your own life likes the Beatles, they were kind of influenced by Hindu beliefs, and actually spent some time, I think, in India learning from a guru, which was like somebody that was very in touch with Hindu principles and lived by those. So kind of a side story for you there. This overall spirit, universal spirit, is Brahman, which is different from the god Brahma. So that word Brahman, Brahma, is kind of used several different times. So these are pictures of what the gods, and I talk about in class why they have multiple arms, probably trying to show that the gods can be involved in multiple things at the same time. You'll often see like a dot too, and there's even people that wear this. Hindu people wear the dot. It's called the third eye, and the way I kind of interpret that is like, well, what would a third eye do? It allows you to see more clearly, allow you to see maybe things you couldn't see with two eyes. So the third eye is like this ability to see beyond, see into the spiritual. And so that's kind of why I think those people wear that as of like a religious, like a physical representation of what they're trying to attain, like to be able to see something. Hindus also believe in reincarnation, which is the rebirth of a soul into another body. And you may have heard this term karma. We often say like that's bad karma whenever like, but it's kind of the same thing. They use it more of a religious context, but like good deeds allow good things to happen to you. Bad deeds allow bad things to happen to you. And this whole cycle of rebirth happens, and you're trying to reach the end state is not heaven. it's this eternal bliss that's called nirvana, and it's like complete peace. So that's kind of the goal of Hinduism, and they believe you can be reincarnated as like an animal or an insect. Um, Hindus are also into non-injury. Maybe you've heard that they don't like kill cows. I think it's one of the gods, Brahma, I think, is said to like reside inside cows. So they consider cows holy and they will not kill cows. So they just kind of like wander the streets everywhere. But that kind of like that non-injury, it leads to this belief of Jainism. And in Jainism, even people wear kind of like masks like this, not because of coronavirus or anything like that, but they wear those as not to kill or injure anything else. I've even heard like not even accidentally like stepping on a bug or even inhaling something that, like a bug or something like that. This kind of like extreme example of non-injury, which is a part of Hinduism as well, but it would lead to this not as maybe followed or as big of as a religion, but Jainism is a religion that kind of fits with that. And the other religion we're going to talk about here is Buddhism. And Buddhism was founded by this guy named Siddhartha Gautama. And he was this noble prince, and he kind of gave it all up and lived a life of poverty, seeking spiritual truth. When you see these statues, I'm sure you've seen with the long ears, that is supposed to be the Buddha. And there's also the laughing Buddha, which is kind of different than that. But these statues are kind of like a reminder of what he attained at the age of 35. They said he kind of reached enlightenment. And so that's why he is known as the Buddha, the enlightened one. How do you do that? Well, he came up with these 4 noble truths. Life is suffering. I talk about this more in class, but just that life is full of bad things that happen. And it's often caused by selfish desire, the want for fame or fortune or more food, more contentment. If you can kind of empty yourself of that desire through this 8-fold path, which is like having the right speech, right action, right way of living, right effort, being right in all of your action, you can attain that. So it's not really about like, Christianity is about like forgiveness of sins and like this need for a savior, and some other religions are more about like the worship of a deity. In Buddhism, it's more about like what you can do to become a better person, to empty yourself of desire and to reach this level of nirvana. So they rejected the class system because they really believe that if you lived a right life, you can kind of improve yourself, and a caste system would keep you kind of limited to that. So Buddhism doesn't really have a strong following in India. It would kind of more the areas we've already talked about in East Asia and Southeast Asia. That's more where we'd find Buddhism. But Siddhartha Gautama was from India, and so that's kind of where the religion started. The Aryan civilization fades out. We give rise to a couple of other ones here. We have this leader named Ashoka, and he converts to Buddhism, which is really interesting because to be a leader, you like often have to conquer other people, and that's what he did at first. And then he like becomes Buddhist, and they're all about pacifism and non-violence. So that's kind of interesting with Ashoka, his conversion to Buddhism. We have the Gupta Empire, which did a lot of advancements in learning, and they brought in what we use today as the modern decimal system. They kind of discovered that originally, so that's kind of their major contribution. And then the Mughals here, they were all about Akbar the Great was their kind of key leader, and they were Muslim, which is interesting because most of India is not Muslim today. Maybe you've heard of the Taj Mahal. It was kind of built under this, and it's an example of Islamic architecture with those like spiral kind of like columns, or like more like onion shaped, I guess. That's a Islamic form of architecture. And they were really about like, they were religiously tolerant, so they allowed other people to practice other religions. But the Taj Mahal was built during their kind of rule. And there is the Taj Mahal. These are those onion type tops that I was talking about. They're not really onions. So then we lead into more modern times here, and the British will come to control India. And some of these other areas didn't even exist yet, like Pakistan doesn't exist in modern day Pakistan. So there's this rebellion, and then it becomes a British colony. And so the British took control. This map shows like British territories and then kind of expanding basically to control all of that. And then that's when these two guys come on the stage here, Gandhi and Nehru. And we're probably more familiar with Gandhi. Might wonder why he doesn't have a shirt on there. Like, he was all about like he used social disobedience. So civil disobedience, not social disobedience. He encouraged a boycott of any British goods. So he like dressed in very simple clothing. He fasted a lot. You're going to do some reading in class about him and just some things that he did. He would ultimately end up getting assassinated for kind of like being a person that was kind of rebelling against that who was in control. He had a huge influence on people like Martin Luther King Jr. because he didn't protest with violence. He protested with nonviolence. He actually did cause a lot of the change to come around. So there's been movies made about him. This is a movie clip. So he was against violence. His most powerful weapon against British rule was civil disobedience or nonviolent resistance. His life kind of he began practicing law in South Africa, which is another area we'll talk about where colonization really caused like separation of people. There's a thing called apartheid that we're going to talk about. And so he kind of like lived some of his early years of life seeing that, and then went home and said, like, this cannot happen. We cannot have British people controlling the Indian people and telling them what to do and suppressing our culture. And so that's part of the reason for the independence movement that he led. So it was kind of like towards the end of his life that he was assassinated. You can see, he looks quite a bit different in this picture. This was kind of like towards the end of his life. He's often called Mahatma Gandhi, which means great soul. And it does become independent in 1947 based on a lot of his work. And like I said, he was assassinated there. It's kind of a little bit hard to read that. There was religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims, and he was in favor of, and what actually happened, Pakistan was separated from India because it mainly was Islamic. That's where kind of like, Akbar the Great and that Islamic rule kind of had still a hold over that area. And so they allowed Pakistan to separate from India. Many people did not like that he was kind of like letting that turn that land over. And so that kind of like is the reason for his assassination, that someone disagreed with that. You can read more about him, pretty fascinating guy. And so that's kind of what I was talking about here. Bangladesh becomes independent from Pakistan as well. So there's still that religious tension between India and Pakistan today. Our book talks about nuclear proliferation, which is like the development of nuclear weapons and like an arms race type of thing. And that's still, I think it's maybe gotten a little bit more under control recently, but kind of comes back to that religious tension that existed between these areas. So a lot of history. Definitely the Indus River Valley civilization and Buddhism and Hinduism are really, really important. And then knowing who Gandhi is and his influence on India. We'll talk a little bit more about him later on in the week as well. So that wraps up section 2 of chapter 6. Thanks for watching.